This video is part of the economics section of our class. It deals with the supply curve, and then when we cross the supply curve with the demand curve, we talk about market equilibrium. Now, this presentation contains a number of the economics subject areas that are covered within the BEC portion of the CPA exams. It contains several summaries of these areas regarding supply curve and market equilibrium, and contains questions similar to what may be encountered on the exam. So one of the important things here is that you take a look and you practice these practice questions, because these are questions you will have never seen before, and you will be able to practice them in your own time, and when you're ready you can look up the answers as part of the video. Now, the best way to use this presentation is when you review the video, when a question is asked, stop the video at that point and study and then answer the question. When you're ready, then restart the video after you've answered the question, and the video will talk about the correct answer and why the answer is incorrect, and in many cases why the other answers are incorrect. So the first thing, let's go on and talk about some additional resources regarding the supply curve and market equilibrium. What I have done here is that if you need additional information or lecture regarding the supply curve and market equilibrium, I've included the links to the Khan Academy videos, and the Khan Academy is by a teacher named Solomon Khan, and he does an excellent job of explaining items that tend to be complicated to students. He has a way of breaking them down and making them uncomplicated. So if you're interested in looking at those subject areas, please utilize these links, which includes, number one, the law of supply, factors that affect supply, long-term supply curve, market equilibrium, and changes in market equilibrium. Okay, so again, utilize those links if you need information or you want to learn more about those items. Let's take a look at the first slide. And what we see now is what we call a simple supply curve. A supply curve reflects the quantity of a product or service supplied at different price levels. So here, if we take a look, we have a vertical axis called price. We have a horizontal axis called quantity. And then we have a line. In this case, the line slopes upward. And this is because people, in this case, well, instead of being consumers, now we're looking at suppliers, which means that suppliers are willing to supply certain quantities of a good or a service based upon the price. And obviously, the higher the price is, the more the quantity that suppliers are going to be able to offer. So as a demand curve is downward sloping, a supply curve is upward sloping. And again, the higher the price, the more producers are willing to supply. The lower the price, the less producers are willing to supply. Now, again, we're going to treat the supply curve a bit like the demand curve here in terms of curve shifts. Again, we have price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. Now, a shift of the supply curve to the left indicates a decrease in supply. In other words, for whatever reason, suppliers are now willing to supply a lower quantity at the same prices when we shift the supply curve to the left. This is also referred to as a negative supply shift. On the other hand, if the supply curve shifts to the right, what happens is a shift of the supply curve to the right indicates that suppliers are willing to increase the supplies or the quantity of goods and services given the same prices. So that's a positive supply shift. Now, if we take a look, just like we did, we took a look at factors that can affect supply. Factors that can affect demand. There's also factors that can impact supply. And we're going to go over some of these in general. Okay, number one, the number of producers. In other words, the number of producers in the market, the producers willing to produce those goods or services. More producers will increase supply, and less producers will decrease supply. And again, that's a fairly logical assumption. Government subsidies. Subsidies or the opposite disincentives can impact the amount producers are willing to supply. Government subsidies that reduce cost to the producer will most likely increase the supply, while government actions that can increase the cost to a supplier will probably decrease supply. Price expectations, and this is on the supplier side, not the consumer side. Producers may supply more or less based upon their their expectations of future prices. Supplies will increase in that producers expect lower prices in the future, while supply will decrease if producers expect higher prices in the future. And again, that's a very logical assumption. Now that we've been exposed to the supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve, what we can do now is we can plot a demand curve for a normal good and also the related supply curve for that particular normal good. And we will then, when we do the plot, we will end up with what we call an equilibrium point where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. And we call that market equilibrium. And that is a price where the quantity demanded and the quantity supply curve, as I mentioned, where they intersect. So in this case, what would happen is once we plot the supply curve and the demand curve, basically what will happen is at the price of P1, a certain quantity Q1 will be demanded and the market will be at equilibrium. If they're at any other point along those lines, they will eventually go to the intersection of P1 and Q1. So this is called the equilibrium point. Now that we've talked about market equilibrium, we're going to go on and examine what happens to market equilibrium when we have shifts in the demand and the supply curve. Now, we're going to take a look at what happens in the case of a demand curve shift. When a demand curve shifts, what happens with market equilibrium? So here's an illustration, and again, if we take a look at the white line, that's our original demand curve, the white with the D, and we can look at where it intersects with our supply curve, and we can see where those 2 points intersect at P and Q. That's our market equilibrium. That's the price and the quantity. That's where basically the quantity supplied at the right price and the market demanding at the right price, where those intersect. Let's assume that the quantity demanded has a shift to the right, and that would be represented by this orangish line, which I call D+, which says basically I've shifted my demand curve to the right. I've had a positive shift in demand. Now you can see that with that shift, I have a new equilibrium point. And you can see again where those points intersect. And you can see in this case, if I compare it to my original demand, what is my new equilibrium point? I know that my price is actually going to increase. So I know the equilibrium point, the price is going to increase, and the quantity demanded is also going to increase. On the other hand, let's assume that the demand curve shifts to the left. In this case, you can see the intersection, and the intersection shows that based upon that, I now have a quantity demanded quantity that is going to be lower than the original curve, and the price is going to be lower than the original curve. So I can make some generalizations about this, and based upon my generalizations, I can create this chart. If I have a positive demand curve shift, in order to achieve equilibrium, I will have to have an increase in price, and I will have to have an increase in quantity. If I have a negative demand curve shift, I will have a decrease in price and a decrease in quantity in order to achieve equilibrium. So I can either memorize this chart here, or if I'm in the exam and I don't really remember this chart, I can go back and basically draw this sort of diagram to come up with whether prices and quantities will rise or fall based upon the shift in demand. Okay, now we've talked about demand. Now let's talk about shifts in supply. Again, here you see a demand and supply curve depicted. And in this case, what you see is the demand curve is downward sloping, as a demand curve should be, and my supply curve is upward sloping. And where these two white lines meet, that's my market equilibrium, which is P and Q for quantity. Now, if I have a positive shift in my supply, I will go to the S plus curve, that orange curve. And in this case, what will happen is you'll notice where I draw my intersection, I'm going to have an increase in my quantity over the original amount demanded, and I'm going to have a decrease in price over the original price for market equilibrium. When my supply curve shifts to the left, what's going to happen again is I'm going to draw a new equilibrium point on crossing the demand curve. In this case, when I draw that, I can see that in order to achieve that equilibrium, my price is going to have to increase over the original price, and it's going to have to, my quantity is going to have to decrease over the original quantity over the original quantity supplied. And again, I can summarize this in this following chart. If I have a positive supply curve shift, in order to achieve market equilibrium, I'm going to have a decrease in my price, and an increase in my quantity. If I have a negative supply curve shift, I'm going to have an increase in price and a decrease in quantity, again, to achieve market equilibrium. So that's a summary in terms of demand and supply when one curve moves. Now, the problem is that both curves can move at the same time. Now, I did not create a depiction of that because I think it's a little bit more difficult to illustrate. But here's what happens when we have shifts in supply and demand. If we have a positive shift in supply and demand, okay, so a positive supply and demand curve shift, in order to achieve market equilibrium, we cannot determine the price, but we do know the quantity is going to increase. So we don't know whether the price is going to increase or decrease, but we know the quantity is going to increase. If we have a negative supply and a demand curve shift, in other words, both are negative, again, in order to achieve equilibrium, we don't know if that will result in an increase or decrease in price, but we do know that will result in a decrease in quantity. Then lastly, if the supply and the demand curves move in opposite directions, whatever opposite directions they move in, the price and the quantity to achieve equilibrium cannot be determined. Okay, now with this chart in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at, as a matter of fact, this won't even involve that chart, but take a look at question 1. It says, producers expect prices to fall in the near future. Based upon this expectation, the supply curve will shift. Now, we're not asking for equilibrium. We're just asking is which way will the supply curve shift? So go ahead, take a look at the question, stop the video. When you're ready, when you've made your answer, go ahead and restart the video and review question 1 answer. Okay, question number 1. Okay, in this case, if producers expect prices to fall in the near future, that will shift the supply curve to the right. What that means is producers will be willing to supply more to the current market to take advantage of the higher prices in anticipation of future price decreases. And you can see this depicted here, where there will be additional supply. So we have a positive shift, supply shift, which is a shift to the right. Let's try question number 2. The government creates tax incentives that allow producers to invest in more productive means of making things. In this case, the supply curve will shift to the, and again, we're not asking about market equilibrium in this case, we're simply asking which way will the supply curve shift. So again, review the question, or stop the video, review the question, arrive at an answer. When you've arrived at the answer, go ahead and start the video again. Okay, in this case, the curve will shift, the supply curve will shift to the right. And the reason for that is producers will invest in additional production capacity, which will increase the supply, resulting in a positive supply shift. In other words, a shift to the right, and here it is depicted in the answer to the question. Okay, let's take a look now at number 3. Market conditions result in a positive shift for demand and supply. Which of the following statements is true regarding, now we're talking about market equilibrium? So go ahead, stop the video, do your analysis, arrive at your answer, and when you're ready, go ahead and restart the video for the answer to number 3. Okay, in this case, we're talking about a positive shift for both demand and supply. So if we take a look at our chart here that we have memorized, what we say is that if we have a positive supply and demand curve shift, they both shift positively. In order to achieve market equilibrium, we cannot determine whether the price will increase or decrease. We don't know. But we do know the quantity will increase to achieve equilibrium. So in this case, the correct answer would be C. Equilibrium will be established at higher quantity levels, but price change cannot be determined. Okay, let's take a look at number 4. Market conditions result in a positive shift for demand and a negative shift for supply. What is the impact on quantity and price to achieve, I'm adding this, to achieve market equilibrium. So again, stop your video, do your analysis, make your choice, and when you're ready for the answer, go ahead and restart the video. Okay, in this case, the question was asking what conditions, basically, what would happen if we had a positive shift for demand and a negative shift for supply. So again, we go down and we notice that basically a positive shift versus a negative shift means that both curves are moving in opposite directions. So in this case, the supply and demand curves move in opposite directions, which means in order to achieve equilibrium, we really can't determine whether the price is going to increase or decrease, and the same with the quantity. So the correct answer in this case is D, cannot determine price or quantity changes. Now let's look at number 5. Market conditions result in a negative shift for demand and a negative shift for supply. What is the impact on quantity and price, again, to achieve equilibrium, I might add? So go ahead, do your analysis, come up with your answer, and then stop the video, do your analysis, come up with your answer, and when you're ready, go ahead and start the video to look at the answer to number 5. Okay, in this case, we have a negative shift for demand and a negative shift for supply. So again, looking at our chart, we have a negative supply and demand curve shift. In this case, to achieve market equilibrium, we can't determine whether the price is going to increase or decrease. We just can't tell that. But we do know that the quantity is going to decrease in this particular case. So the correct answer in this case would be B, quantity will decrease, price is indeterminate. Now let's try another market equilibrium problem, problem number 6. Market conditions result in a positive shift for supply. What is the impact on the quantity and price in order to achieve market equilibrium? Stop the video, go ahead, do your analysis, arrive at your answer, and when you're done, go ahead and restart the video so you can view the answer to number 6. Okay, the answer to number 6 is C, quantity will increase, price will decrease. Okay, we look for a positive shift for supply. Now in this case, we then look at our handy-dandy chart, and it says positive supply curve shift. In this case, the price will decrease to achieve market equilibrium, and the quantity will increase to achieve market equilibrium. So C says quantity will increase and price will decrease. So that's the answer for number 6. Let's take a look now at number 7. And these are questions that deal with imposed price ceilings. And price ceilings or price floors are generally generated by the government for political ends, to basically say you can't charge more than this legally, or there may be a situation such as in agriculture where you're not allowed to charge anything lower than a particular price. Well, just because you create that, that creates disruptions in the marketplace. Instead of the market finding its own equilibrium, these imposed conditions can cause basically a shortage of supply or a overage of supply, depending upon what happens. Now, we're going to learn about this by looking at this question. Number 7, an imposed price ceiling where the ceiling is below the market equilibrium point. And you have 4 responses. Now again, why don't you go ahead and take a look at that and do your analysis. Also stop the video first, do your analysis, arrive at what you believe to be the correct answer. And after you've arrived at the answer, go ahead and restart the video and look at the answer to question 7. Again, this is pretty much a learning slide. Okay, the answer in this particular case is that if you impose a price ceiling where the ceiling is below the market equilibrium point, in other words, that price ceiling is basically, it's a bargain price, and we'll see this in a second. If you do that, what will happen is that will result in a market, basically a market shortage. Now, what you can see here with this supply-demand chart is the supply curve for that particular good and the demand curve for that particular good. However, what you see here is I've drawn a line across price under P1. And this is the price ceiling. In other words, this is as much as anybody's allowed to charge. Now, what you see is the actual equilibrium point would be at the intersection of price versus quantity. So at that particular point, the price would be established and the quantity, they would balance out. But in this case, with the price ceiling, what happens is that at that price, consumers or people who consume or consumers are basically going to demand a higher quantity of that product based upon the curve intersection with the price ceiling. Yet, on the other hand, suppliers are going to only produce so much because that's all they're going to produce based upon that price level. So what you have is you have a quantity supplied here of so much. I'm losing my marker here. Okay, the quantity supplied of so much, Q right here, the quantity supplied, yet the quantity demanded is going to be far in excess of that. So in effect, customers will demand a higher quantity than producers are willing to supply, leading to a shortage in the market instead of letting the market reach market equilibrium. Okay, let's go on to question number 8. Now in this case, an imposed price floor exists in the market. In other words, you can't sell it below a particular product. Now, if the floor is lowered, which of the following is true? So again, perform your own analysis. Stop the video, perform your own analysis. Arrive at an answer, and when you are ready, go ahead and restart the video. Okay, the answer to number 8 is A. Producers will produce more than the market demands. And again, what you can see, this is a price floor. The equilibrium point is below the price floor. And what that means is that the quantity demanded at that price will be a certain amount, and the quantity supplied at that price floor will be a certain amount. But again, we have an imbalance because we have an equilibrium would have been at a lower point. So the price floor is above market equilibrium. So in this case, what's going to happen is producers will produce more than the market demands, and there will be a surplus. So producers will produce more than demanded by the market, which will result in a surplus of the product. With that, that's the end of our instructor video for this particular segment of supply and market equilibrium.